Welcome to the School of Batman, a podcast where we ask academics to help Batman fight crime using their research. I'm your host, Chris George, amateur scientist and professional Batman enthusiast. And in today's episode, we'll be discussing the Quakemaster's aftermath. We're pleased to be joined by Dan Gillis, who has a PhD in statistics and is currently the Associate Professor in the School of Computer Science at the University of Guelph. We'd like to start the podcast, Dan, with a bit of background on yourself. I always find it interesting how people got to the positions they're in, how they got to the work they're in. It's often very specialised, and that journey is really interesting to me and hopefully to our listeners. So how did you get to where you are today? What was interesting you as a kid? What were some of your choices?
Good question. So when I was a kid, actually, I was a giant nerd. I loved math. And I would often struggle at night to go to sleep because I'd be constantly thinking about numbers and number patterns and such. I had no idea that was a thing that I could do sort of as a career. But it was interesting because when I was finishing up high school, I was debating between computer science and also animation. Because I loved animation as well.
What kind of year would that have been?
So I finished high school in 93. So around 93, 94 was when I was trying to figure out all this stuff.
Right, so well before the kind of Toy Stories of the world and that kind of thing.
Yeah. And I thought computer science would be a nice backup. So when I got to do my undergrad, I did start in computer science, but math kept drawing me back, and eventually I realized that was where I needed to be, and so I ultimately switched into mathematics. And then while I was doing that, and doing my master's in mathematics, I was really given a lot of opportunity to try weird and wonderful things and get connected with people. And so I worked for the Public Health Agency of Canada for a period. I had a consulting business for a period. Ultimately, what happened was the Public Health Agency of Canada, they needed someone to do some analyses looking at climate change data and trying to understand the potential impacts of weather variables and climate change on the underlying sort of rates of gastrointestinal disease, foodborne illness, that sort of thing. So they helped support me through my PhD. While I was doing my PhD, I then also got connected with another faculty member on campus who was doing work with two First Nations in Ontario, the Saugeen Ojibwe First Nations. And they ultimately, when I finished my PhD, decided to co-sponsor my faculty position. And they brought that to the University of Guelph and said, we would like to do this. And so the university saw this as a great opportunity and they created my position. And I basically, about 8 months after I finished my PhD, I started as a faculty member in the School of Computer Science, and I've been here ever since.
Great. So I think you're right. I think the idea of being able to do mathematics as a career is very difficult to comprehend to people kind of outside of the field. So if you were talking to someone who would be interested in how can I make maths a job, what kind of avenues would be open to them?
It's incredible, actually, the opportunities for people who have mathematics or statistics as a background, or even computer science. The opportunities are similar, and they're vast. So a lot of people assume with mathematics, all you're doing is number crunching all day long, and that's not necessarily the case. In fact, it's rarely, I would say, the case that you're doing nothing but number crunching. Mathematics, statistics, computer science, it's all about being able to look at the world and break it down and sort of model it and develop tools that will allow you to sort of simplify the world so you can test assumptions about it. The cool part about it is that it's limited only by your imagination. So you can use mathematics and statistics to solve a lot of different problems. So if you're interested in mathematics and you've got a passion in something else, I guarantee that there's some way that you can combine the two and do something amazing with it.
Great, thanks very much, and good luck to anyone out there who's interested in a career in maths. So Dan, I think it's now time we move on to your story. And one of the most important aspects for me is which Batman actor you've chosen to represent your Batman in your story. So who have you chosen?
I'm going to have to go with Adam West.
Adam West, okay. We'll try the story and then we'll see how Adam fits into it. A great choice. A single warning was all Gotham got. The Quakemaster appears on all devices simultaneously, portentously alluding to a vulgar display of power to come. Then the demands. Batman must deliver himself to the secret society of supervillains, or the next attack won't be so localized. Almost immediately after the screen bursts into static, a distant rumble begins as communications start to fall. Cell towers and internet communications start to fail across the city as chaos begins to spread. Running to the Batcave, now is the time for Batman to unleash Plan Mesh. So, as that story contained the Quakemaster and the secret society of supervillains, I can understand why you chose Adam West there, so a very good choice. So, now, Gotham is in a bit of a state. The Quakemaster has clearly destroyed communications across the city, leaving some buildings tumbling, no one able to communicate with anyone. So what exactly is Plan Mesh, and how can Batman help, and how can you help Batman?
Whew. Good question. So, Plan Mesh. Plan Mesh is, the idea there is to use devices that are already in Gotham. The cell phones, the routers, the tablets, computers, laptops, any device that has Wi-Fi Direct, or Bluetooth technologies enabled in it. And the idea is to use those things and to connect them in a network so that people can actually communicate without having access to the internet or cell towers.
So I'm going to ask for a bit of clarification here, because I think to a lot of people the terms Wi-Fi and internet connection are kind of synonymous with each other. So can you talk a little bit about how Wi-Fi and the idea of Wi-Fi is kind of disconnected from the idea of internet?
So Wi-Fi is simply the ability to connect computers through wireless connections. So it can exist sort of independently, if you will, of the internet. The internet is the formal sort of highway that's connecting computers and allowing information to be shared. But Wi-Fi is sort of another tool on top of that allows us to connect devices without actually having to wire into them.
Right, so I could communicate from my router to my computer information without there actually being internet.
Right.
Right, okay. So Batman being able to unleash Plan Mesh, that sounds like something he would have had to have been preparing for, and knowing that he is the world's greatest detective and always prepared, this is something he's probably been planning for a while. So these devices, would he have had to have done anything to these devices before the fact to be able to unleash Plan Mesh?
Yes, absolutely. Batman would have had to have done something to prepare for this. And yes, he's always prepared. So the basic thing that would have needed to have been done is developing sort of a platform that will allow the devices to communicate effectively and seamlessly, and in a way that doesn't require people in Gotham to actually set up their phones or their tablets in a complicated way. Like we want this to be done, or Batman would want this to be done very easily. So essentially, Batman would have had to have developed a platform that could be simply added to the phone as a simple app, or API calls or something to that effect, that once I connect to it, everything else is seamless. And so it's just a matter of making sure the devices have access to that sort of platform.
So these communications go down. This hidden app that's been surreptitiously implanted across all of these different devices, and I guess that app is not just limited to phones, right? This could be computers, you say routers, tablets, that kind of thing. With that app, that could then bring itself to the surface. And then how would it go about starting to look for other things? Because I'm struggling to get my head around the idea of communication without internet. So let's start with a very simple situation. Say you've got neighbours, they've got two phones, they've both got this secret app on it. Plan mesh is unleashed. What would be happening then? Would that app be actively looking for other devices? What would you call those devices?
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, what will happen is once the platform is launched, the platform is set up so that any other app or whatever doesn't have to have any special programming in it. So any other communication tool on the device wouldn't have to have any special code built into it. It just communicates through the platform. But essentially what would happen is the platform would use the different technologies, the Wi-Fi, the Bluetooth, the Wi-Fi Direct and such, and look in the neighborhood for other signals coming from this particular platform. And each individual device would be provided some sort of identification key so that it could be recognized, so that if I knew I needed to send information from one phone to another particular phone or device, I can use those IDs to share that information.
Okay, so I'm kind of visualizing this as like raindrops starting to fall on a lake or on a pond, with these concentric circles starting to merge into each other. Is that a reasonable visualization of how this would start to work?
Yes, I think the raindrop idea is a good one, because the raindrops would represent randomly where the citizens of Gotham might be, and those circles would represent the signals being sent out from each of the different devices, and that's how basically each of those ripples would be a hello handshake sort of thing that would allow other devices to know who's in the neighborhood, and who they can communicate with potentially.
So would you utilizing this technology, would you potentially be able to build up a picture of like concentration of devices? For example, let's say a building tumbled and an office building and collapsed and was covered in rubble. Would you be able to then communicate with devices in there? Would you be able to tell, let's say in a rather naughty way, each device has a key, as you mentioned, but that was also assigned to a persona? Would you then be able to identify the actual people in various locations?
I believe so, yes. I can't see any reason why that couldn't be done, unless for some reason the person had set up an anonymous, like they wanted to remain anonymous or something like that. But I don't see any reason why that couldn't be the case. And which, in a situation as you described, where a building is collapsed or something, it could be used to help identify where people are, and provide enough information to get rescue to that individual or individuals.
Great. So we've talked about kind of one-to-one communication. Would this type of idea support a one-to-many communication? Could the powers of the city and Batman himself communicate to all these devices at the same time?
It would depend on the potential app that is communicating through the platform, but in theory, absolutely. An example here, if Batman wanted to send out a communique through Facebook, for example, Facebook in theory could be connected through this particular platform, and that message could then be shared with everybody. There's also, I don't see any reason why it couldn't be set up to send out a communique to multiple people in the network as well. I feel like that would be relatively trivial to have set up.
So if I wanted to communicate or Batman, I often use the two terms interchangeably, if Batman wanted to communicate from one side of the city to another, how would that work? Because there might be many different devices. I'm imagining, let's say, some devices only have Bluetooth only. That's got a range of 30 meters. Different Wi-Fi's won't stretch across a whole city. How would that message go from one side of the city to another?
So this is absolutely where density becomes important. So within a city, density is probably not going to be an issue. The number of devices per square kilometer or what have you. In general, if the density is there, getting the message from one spot to another isn't terribly complicated. I mean, there's some other stuff that goes on in the background there, obviously. It's when the density is lower that there might be gaps that exist. But the general idea is if the density is high enough, then I can easily figure out a path to pass along the information that I have to any number of devices between me and the intended device that I want the message to go to. The part of the challenge then is identifying, well, what is the most efficient pathway? How many hops does it take to get from where I am to where the message needs to go? And then some other things that have to occur in there is, well, what happens if one of the devices that I was going to use as a hop suddenly turns off or moves? And so there's some dynamic stuff going on in there, but Batman's smart enough to sort out all of that and have it figured out so that the message can go from where it needs to be, or where it starts from to where it needs to be.
Yeah, so you could, in theory, use this app to say, I need help, press this button, and that could communicate to the emergency services, and it could allow the emergency services and Batman to pinpoint locations, even though the communications were down.
Yeah, there's a significant amount of potential for what the mesh could be used to do, especially in the case of emergency situations or safety situations.
So thanks to Plan Mesh, the citizens of Gotham will be able to communicate whether they need help, they'll be able to be sent safety information, and they'll be able to get back on their feet, hopefully, as soon as possible. So thanks very much for listening, and thanks to Dan Gillis for joining us.
Yeah, I had a blast. That was so much fun.
You can follow Dan at Dr. Daniel Gillis on Twitter. If you'd like to discuss your research on a future episode, email us at info@figshare.com.